Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Reece, an assistant professor in the city planning program at Ohio State. I recorded a few of the videos for week 2, and as part of week 3, I have 2 videos that I'll be sharing this week. The first focused on the Euclid case and really some of the acknowledgement during the Euclid case of the problematic nature of potential racial or social exclusion from Euclid, as well as the way that the court in 1926 frames our discussion of multifamily land use and apartments going forward. So as we get moving here, as I noted in the run of show document with some of the reflection questions, before going through this recording, I would recommend reading both the Hirt reading and the Euclid case prior to viewing this presentation. I had 2 primary things that I would suggest that you maybe want to focus on in both of those readings. First, noting in the context of the Hirt reading, what are the 2 hypotheses explaining the divergence of US and European zoning models? And in the context of Euclid, how does the Supreme Court discuss multifamily and or apartments in the context of neighborhood quality of life? More specifically, how does the court articulate this idea that apartments are near nuisances in the context of their impact on single-family residential neighborhoods? So if you haven't read those yet, go ahead and pause the video and take a chance to, or excuse me, take an opportunity to read those articles, because that'll be very helpful as we move forward. If you have read the articles, we'll just continue on and move on into the context of our discussion. So I'm going to start with Hirt's article as kind of an opening as we think about these kind of evolution of zoning in the 1920s. And Hirt puts forth really 2 hypotheses that seeks to understand why the US zoning regime would differ from the application of zoning in the European context. The first idea here is the notion that many of the pastoral ideas regarding the supremacy of private homes and reflecting back on our week 2 lectures, the importance of the single-family residential land use as a part of our urban communities as really being critical in the context of the American experience, and we see that reflected in our zoning ordinances. Second, a reflection that the context of racial, ethnic, and class conflicts and discrimination in the American city was really critical to the racial and class divisions that would be codified in space through our zoning ordinances and various other forms of residential restrictions. So we see kind of 2 unique aspects of the American context, which really informs then why zoning takes on a particular flavor in the realm of US zoning ordinances. And as we kind of dive into some of the discussion around Euclid, I want you to think about how these 2 themes are apparent in the context of some of the debates with Euclid. So again, kind of going back to some material we covered in week 2, as we think about early zoning as a form of social control, I want to note that there are various forms of zoning exclusion that vary in the context of the application of zoning. In week 2, we talked about racial zoning, which was racially explicit in sorting people in the context of where they could live in the context of the city. And of course, racial zoning is struck down in 1917 in the Buchanan v. Worley case. But as we learn in the week 2 materials, that does not stop kind of the influence of racial zoning in many cities. In the context of the discussions around Euclid today, we're really going to talk about exclusionary zoning. right? And in this context where zoning restrictions on multifamily, on density, on use, et cetera, limits the availability of affordable housing, or even in some cases moderately priced housing in particular neighborhoods, therefore limiting access to those neighborhoods for low to moderate income populations. And then finally, we'll get into this in my second video this week, processes of expulsive zoning, where we allow more intensive manufacturing or industrial uses in lower income communities or neighborhoods that are racially diverse. So obviously, many of you have taken basic planning history, and you've heard about Euclid and the importance of Euclid. You've probably already read the decision before in that context, but just a little reflection on just the significance of Euclid. Of course, this is the first zoning case to get to the Supreme Court in 1926. And as we've discussed earlier in our videos and discussions, the legal authority for zoning was not clear at this time, nor had it been really tested in relation to the Supreme Court and its constitutionality. Euclid, of course, is important because this is a situation where SCOTUS expressly adapts the Constitution to modern life, which I'll get into here in a second. And it's a strong endorsement for expanding the police power to support land use regulation. And finally, this is kind of the first recognition of the validity of systematic governmental land use controls in the context of Euclid. And if you do look at kind of the spread of zoning after Euclid, you certainly see a relationship between just the number of zoning ordinances in the US, or a number of communities that are utilizing zoning, which quickly expands in the aftermath of Euclid. So we see in 1925, there's a little under 400 communities that have zoning. That expands to upwards of 1,000 in 1930. And then by the time we get to the 1960s, with the increased suburbanization and the incorporation of suburban areas who then embrace zoning, we see over 5,000 local communities using zoning by the 1960s. So the traditional way that Euclid is often framed and taught is that Euclid is a progressive policy reform. Right? And in short, as I'll kind of paraphrase here, this idea that the Supreme Court recognizes that modern cities require modern land use solutions. And pulling directly from language of the Euclid case, you see this really strongly reflected in the way that the court talks about just the evolution of urban life in the early part of the 20th century, and that this evolution of a growing population and density and intensity of land use and technology and changing infrastructure, again, requires new tools to help cities remain orderly and to uphold the public purpose of health, safety, and welfare. As we kind of think about this in the context of this class, though, often this kind of more general view of Euclid ignores some of the more problematic aspects of the case, and even the way that the courts framed things such as apartments or multifamily use in the context of Euclid. And pulling directly from some of the writings of Professor Whitmore, as Professor Whitmore acknowledges here, the critique of Euclidean zoning as an exclusionary measure was not something that was limited to kind of our contemporary debates. And in fact, from early on, there was a recognition of the exclusive effects of Euclid, or in this context, Euclidean zoning, early in kind of this experiment with Euclidean zoning in the US. And we see this directly reflected in the lower court decision in the U.S. District Court of Northern Ohio in 1924. Of course, the lower court decision, the judge, in this case, Judge David Westenhaver, who was a federal district court judge of Northern Ohio, was highly critical of the Euclid ordinance and acknowledged its relationship to social segregation. Judge Westenhaver references the Buchanan case and talks about how if the Buchanan case had not been overturned, he anticipated that we would see an expansion of racial zoning, and also probably racial or ethnic zoning targeting immigrant communities because of the desire in many cities to spatially segregate residents. And as kind of famous quote from the lower court decision that I'll paraphrase here quickly, Westenhaver notes that the purpose in this case of how he sees zoning is to really regulate the mode of living of persons who may inhabit these various spaces, right? And then of course his very infamous phrase here, the result is then to classify the population and segregate them according to their income or situation in life. Now, these discussions around exclusion are not taken up by the Supreme Court, but we should recognize that the lower court was very clear in recognizing the potential discriminatory effects of Euclid and how it could kind of reshape access to different neighborhoods via, in particular, restrictions on multifamily zoning. So as we enter into the 1926 Supreme Court decision in Euclid, kind of moving beyond that more progressive kind of interpretation of Euclid, we really should kind of focus in on, in particular, how the court discusses the role of apartments in multifamily land use and the context of the virtues of single-family residential space. And the first item I'll note here is the statement of the court where apartments are actually seen as parasitic in the context of their effects on single-family detached housing neighborhoods. And here again, to kind of quickly paraphrase what the court acknowledged or notes here, that in such single-family sections, the apartment house is a mere parasite constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of single-family residential districts of detached housing. So again, early on, you see this kind of very derogatory view of apartments and their influence on space, on these spaces of single-family detached residential housing. SCOTUS goes even farther in this discussion, kind of articulating all these various ways that apartments are detrimental to single-family detached residential neighborhoods, noting that they interfere with the height and bulk of the free circulation of air and monopolize the rays of the sun, bringing increased noise and activity such as traffic, depriving children of quiet open spaces for play, and finally, collectively, really kind of, as the Supreme Court notes, ruining really what made the detached single-family residential community desirable just by their mere presence. Now, this is a very, very derogatory view of apartments in this context. And we do have to kind of think about this in the context of earlier planning history, where the court kind of pictures apartments in relation to single-family residential units almost as, you know, the old tenement buildings with their hyper density and all of the problems of overcrowding and challenges in the context of those types of spaces. When in reality, you know, apartment buildings being built this time were not tenements necessarily, and were very different in this context and included things such as duplexes or triplexes. Yet the court takes this very just kind of universally derogatory view of how apartment buildings interact with this ideal residential space that is consistent of the single-family detached home. And finally, the court concludes that in the context of these particular zones, right, these areas of single-family detached residential housing, that the existence of apartments in this context is what is described as a near nuisance, right? And again, to paraphrase the decision here, under these circumstances, apartment houses, which in a different environment would be not only entirely unobjectionable, but highly desirable, come very near to being nuisances. So here in the context of the Supreme Court, they draw this distinction that the apartment does not fit in the context of the single family detached residential neighborhood, In this context, although the apartment may be okay in some areas of the city, it actually almost or is a near nuisance, and therefore there are valid reasons for excluding them from these neighborhoods. So in reflecting upon this mini lecture, two things I really want you to kind of think about as reflection questions. The first to note that Hirt proposes these two hypotheses to explain the divergence of US and European zoning models. Reflecting on the Euclid case, both the 24 and the 26 decision, how do you see aspects of Hirt's two hypotheses in the court's debate? How do you see this elevation of the single family residential detached home in the context of the way the court views land use? And how do you see aspects of social and racial separation in the context of these cases and where they're discussed or not discussed in the Euclid decisions? My second reflection question is to kind of think about the origins of our resistance to multifamily and apartment buildings that kind of come out of the nuisance case, and this idea of apartments being parasitic or near nuisances. And as you kind of look through the Euclid case and you see this framing and this very derogatory framing of apartments or multifamily use, how are these issues still of concern or debate in the context of contemporary NIMBY conflicts, right? Not in my backyard conflicts, or the resistance to apartments and multifamily? Do we still see evidence of these kind of positions of the Supreme Court in the 1920s in our contemporary debates and conflicts over being able to provide multifamily housing or apartments in residential areas? Thank you again for your time today. And feel free, as I've said in my other videos, feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions and wanted to discuss some of the content in this mini lecture further. Thank you.